The case we are presenting today originates in the late 19th century, in an isolated area of the Appalachians in the United States. Sometime around 1880, a settler family made their home in the mountains, finding a valley that was naturally cut off by its geography. The Jackson family, as they came to be called, began with just 24 individuals who, in their search for religious solitude, opted to sever connections with the external world. The patriarch, Joseph Jackson, set down stringent rules for the little group. Contact with outsiders was forbidden. Weddings were to happen only among the community's own members. And to leave the valley was seen as an unpardonable betrayal. What started as a quest for religious purity quickly turned into an unplanned genetic experiment. For the initial 30 years, the community's growth was slow. Weddings between first cousins grew frequent, and by the time the first generation concluded, the initial indications of genetic issues were already noticeable. Children with slight malformations, challenges with learning, and a high rate of infant death. The second generation, which arrived around 1910, was already showing more severe issues. Recessive genes, now doubled because of the unions between near kin, started to appear more clearly. Babies were born with heart defects from birth, additional fingers, cleft palates, and intellectual disabilities. The lack of proper medical attention and complete isolation only worsened the circumstances. By the time we get to the third generation in the 1930s, the predicament had grown more and more drastic. By this point, almost every resident of the valley shared a significant part of their genetic makeup. It wasn't just about cousins wedding each other anymore, but about individuals who were at the same time cousins, uncles, and nephews within a genetic tapestry so complex it would be impossible to chart accurately. The region's harsh climate, with its brutal winters that cut the community off even further, added to the sense that this little world was the only one that existed. Children who came into the world during this period were raised to think their physical and mental states were normal, given that almost everyone surrounding them showed some kind of deformity or limitation. The fourth generation, arriving around 1950, was distinguished by a peculiar syndrome appearing, which got the local name of the Jackson mark. Infants were born with a bluish tint to their skin, a result of a rare genetic state known as methemoglobinemia, stemming from an enzyme shortfall. Furthermore, serious facial deformities grew common, with underdeveloped jaws, eyes set far apart, and malformed ears. By the time we get to the 1970s, the fifth generation was already displaying alarming indications of genetic decline. Fertility dropped drastically, and infant death rates hit terrifying levels of 60%. Children who made it often couldn't talk or walk and had malformations so severe that some were hardly recognizable as human. It wasn't until 1983 that the case was exposed, when a 16-year-old girl, Mary Jackson, succeeded in escaping the valley during a storm that wrecked part of the fence around the property. Mary. The tale Mary recounted seemed to come directly from a nightmare. Generations dwelling in complete isolation, forced weddings between close family, children born with progressively worse deformities, and all of this just a few dozen kilometers from civilization. The police, skeptical at first, put together an expedition to the valley, and what they discovered confirmed and even surpassed Mary's reports. In the valley, approximately 240 people were living, nearly all of them with some level of physical deformity or cognitive impairment. Authorities found that the community had created its own method of communication, as many members were unable to articulate words correctly. The living situation was primitive, lacking electricity or running water, and a large number of the residents had never laid eyes on a car or seen a television. The health and medical authorities who assessed the community members were horrified by their findings. Many showed conditions doctors had only read about in textbooks, and some deformities were so uncommon they lacked any official name. If you wish to follow additional cases like this one, which impact all of a society and bring hidden truths to light, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss a single investigation. When authorities started their investigation into the Jackson case in February 1983, the initial challenge was to establish each community member's identity. Nobody possessed official documents, and the naming system they used was just as confusing as the family's own genealogical tree. Many individuals shared the exact same name, typically to honor the community's founders, which made it nearly impossible to figure out who was the child of whom. Investigators found that the community kept basic records, chiefly an old Bible, where births and deaths were recorded. These records, however, were inconsistent and often intentionally vague to conceal the real nature of the relationships. The notes frequently left out the parents' names or used broad terms like "child of the valley" for infants born from especially close unions. Among the first witnesses to cooperate was Martha Jackson, a woman around 50 years old who, despite displaying clear physical markers of consanguinity, retained enough cognitive ability to communicate clearly. Martha disclosed that from her childhood, she was instructed that the external world was hazardous and impure, and that only within the family could the blood stay clean. Weddings were determined by the Council of Elders, Martha reported. When a girl reached 13, the elders would gather and decide which man would be her husband. No one ever questioned these decisions. Martha shared that she was, at the same time, the cousin and aunt of her own husband, and that her father was also her great-uncle. The investigation met with considerable resistance from the community's older members. The elders, headed by Ezekiel Jackson, a 70-year-old man who professed to be the keeper of family tradition, declined to cooperate and maintained that authorities had no right to meddle with their customs. "We have lived this way for generations," Ezekiel declared. "Pure blood has kept us strong against the corrupt world." This statement was in drastic contrast to the physical state of the valley's residents. Doctors assessing the community pinpointed a range of rare genetic conditions that had become widespread due to inbreeding. Apert syndrome, identified by craniofacial malformations and fused fingers. Meckel syndrome, leading to encephalocele, protrusion of the brain via the skull, and polydactyly and numerous other conditions that, on their own, are exceptionally rare in the wider population. An especially unsettling discovery occurred when investigators located what was known as the House of Special Children. This was a separate cabin where children with the most profound deformities were housed, some of them chained to crude beds. These children, many unable to feed themselves or manage basic bodily functions, were given minimal care and, based on reports, often died during the winter. The investigation also uncovered that the community had created its own mythology to account for the deformities. Children born with severe problems were seen as marked by God, as a trial of faith. In certain instances, specific deformities were taken as signs of spiritual power, and some of the most severely afflicted children were regarded as oracles, whose garbled sounds were interpreted as divine messages. As the investigation moved forward, researchers started to grasp that they were dealing with a case without precedent in modern medical texts. Never had a community that engaged in systematic inbreeding for so many sequential generations been documented. Geneticist Dr. Robert Keller, who was part of the investigation, characterized the case as an involuntary genetic experiment that showed the absolute limits of what occurs when a gene pool is critically diminished. The investigation team ran into another major hurdle: the lack of a suitable legal framework to handle the situation. Technically, consanguineous marriages were against the law in the state, but since none of the marriages had ever been officially recorded, it was hard to ascertain which laws had been broken. Furthermore, many of the people originally responsible for putting this practice in place were already deceased. A pivotal moment in the investigation happened when researchers uncovered evidence that the community hadn't been entirely cut off the whole time. Recovered documents showed that, on occasion, men from the community would venture to nearby towns to get essential supplies. Even more disturbing, there were signs that, at times, women from the outside were brought into the valley, generally against their will, in an effort to renew the blood. Sarah Williams, a 62-year-old woman living in a nearby town, recognized certain specific facial traits in photos shown by investigators. She disclosed that her younger sister had vanished in 1952, at just 17 years old, and was never heard from again. "We always thought she had run off to the big city," Sarah said. "We never guessed she could be so close, living a nightmare." The investigation was also confronted with deep ethical quandaries. How should they proceed with community members who were victims but also enforcers of the system? How could they reintegrate people into society who had never been exposed to the modern world and who, in many cases, had significant cognitive limitations. And, perhaps most critically, how to handle the recently born children, many of whom required urgent medical help. While these complex issues were being discussed, investigators kept untangling the Jackson community's history. Each new finding seemed more disturbing than the last, exposing layers of isolation, abuse, and genetic decay that stretched back over a century. In August 1983, 6 months after the investigation started, researchers made a find that fundamentally altered their understanding of the case. During an excavation of an area close to the community cemetery, they found the remains of over 300 children, a large number of whom showed extreme bone deformities. Subsequent forensic analysis of the remains showed consistent patterns of malformations that grew worse as generations passed. The oldest graves held skeletons with fairly mild anomalies, extra fingers or partial bone fusions. The more recent graves revealed extreme deformities, drastically malformed skulls, missing limbs, and instances of conjoined twins who did not survive birth. Dr. Elizabeth Norcross, a geneticist specializing in rare hereditary diseases, was brought in to analyze the genetic data gathered from living community members. Employing advanced techniques for that era, she successfully reconstructed parts of the Jackson family's genealogical tree. "What we found is without precedent in medical literature," she stated. "The coefficient of inbreeding in the latest generations goes beyond anything ever recorded in human populations. In some instances, we are talking about individuals who share over 70% of their genetic material, something that, in theory, should be impossible in a viable population." Dr. Norcross pinpointed over 40 rare genetic conditions within the community, many of which typically appear in less than 1 in 100,000 people in the general population. Most alarming, though, was the discovery that some of the conditions observed were entirely new to medical science. Combinations of genetic anomalies that had never been documented before, arising from the unique interplay of multiple recessive mutations that would almost never have a chance to show up together in a population with normal genetic diversity. In September 1983, the investigation veered in another unexpected direction when one of the younger community members, 19-year-old Jacob Jackson, started to cooperate extensively with the authorities. Jacob, who had relatively mild facial deformities and retained cognitive capacity, revealed he had suspected for years that something was amiss in his community. "When I was a boy, I found a basic biology book among the supplies the men brought from town," he recounted. "That's when I understood that what they told us about being special and chosen was unreal. We were sick, and our leaders knew it." Jacob disclosed the existence of hidden documents kept by the elders, which contained newspaper clippings and even scientific articles on genetics and heredity. They were aware of what they were causing, he asserted. In private meetings, the elders would discuss which marriages would create fewer monsters. As they put it, this wasn't ignorance, it was intentional control. This disclosure shifted the investigation's nature, which started to take on criminal aspects. If Jacob's claims were true, the community's leaders had knowingly perpetuated practices they knew were harmful, in effect condemning generations of children to lives of pain. The investigation got another boost when scientists were able to analyze DNA samples preserved from the personal belongings of Joseph Jackson, the community's founder. The findings were startling. Joseph himself already carried genes for multiple rare recessive conditions, including the methemoglobinemia that resulted in the bluish skin color in many of his descendants. This finding implied that the choice to found an isolated community and engage in consanguineous marriages might have been driven in part by a wish to conceal a pre-existing genetic condition. In October 1983, authorities made yet another unsettling discovery in a sealed-off basement in the community's main house. Diaries maintained by generations of Jackson women, which chronicled in agonizing detail the births, deformities, and premature deaths. These diaries, penned in a mix of archaic English and a dialect the community had developed, showed that not all had quietly accepted the system forced upon them. There were accounts of escape attempts, of women trying to prevent pregnancies, and even of merciful infanticides when infants were born with deformities incompatible with life. One diary, from 1937, held a particularly heart-wrenching passage. "Today I brought forth what was meant to be my son. But God in his infinite cruelty made him something I cannot recognize as human. His eyes are where his cheeks should be, and there is no trace of a nose or mouth. He did not draw breath thanks to divine mercy. The elder says it is a test of our faith. But what sort of God tests his children this way? I am starting to suspect it is not God testing us, but the men who speak in his name. As these documents were deciphered and analyzed, a more intricate picture of the community began to form. It wasn't just a group uniformly dedicated to fanatical beliefs, but rather a hierarchical social system where an elite group of male leaders held absolute power over the others, using a combination of religious indoctrination and physical isolation. Leave a comment saying, "Never give up on truth if you believe that all missing persons deserve to be found, all victims deserve justice, and all closed communities need to be investigated." In November 1983, following 9 months of intensive investigation, authorities decided to definitively intervene in the Jackson community. The operation, which included medical teams, social workers, psychologists, and police, was meticulously planned to minimize trauma for a population that had never had meaningful contact with the outside world. The 237 surviving members of the community were removed from the valley and temporarily placed in adapted facilities at a state hospital. There, every individual received thorough medical evaluations, which confirmed the devastating scope of the harm done by generations of inbreeding. The exam results were shocking. 98% of the community members showed at least one genetic condition linked to consanguinity. Among children under 10, 100% had multiple conditions, many needing immediate medical intervention. Dr. James Harlow, the medical team's coordinator, stated, "In my 35 years of medical practice, I've never witnessed so many rare conditions concentrated in one group. We are basically seeing the final outcome of a genetic experiment that no ethics board would ever permit." Authorities confronted unparalleled legal and ethical issues, as there were no official records of birth, marriage, or death. Each community member's legal status needed to be established from the ground up. For the children, this involved creating entire legal identities, including birth certificates that, in many cases, could only approximate their ages. The issue of criminal accountability was also complicated. Investigators pinpointed 12 elders who seemed to have been aware of the risks of inbreeding, and yet still enforced it on the community. However, many of these men also displayed cognitive impairments from prior generations of consanguinity. How could one assess the guilt of individuals who were themselves products and victims of the very system they perpetuated? Following lengthy deliberations, authorities chose to concentrate on the rescue and rehabilitation aspects over punishment. Ezekiel Jackson and 2 other elders, who showed full cognitive capacity, were charged with several crimes, including child abuse and criminal negligence. The others were deemed unable to stand trial due to their limitations. In January 1984, the challenging process of integrating the community members into modern society commenced. For the adults, particularly the older ones, the change was incredibly traumatic. Many never completely adjusted and lived out their days in specialized institutions, incapable of processing the vastness and complexity of the world outside the valley. For the children, the outlook was more hopeful, though still difficult. Those with preserved cognitive abilities showed surprising resilience and an ability to adapt. Mary Jackson, whose escape had triggered the whole investigation, became an inspiring figure. After intensive medical treatments and therapy, she succeeded in finishing high school and later became an advocate for the rights of people with genetic disabilities. The children most severely affected were taken into specialized institutions, where they got medical care that, while it couldn't reverse the deformities they had, did manage to significantly enhance their quality of life. Surgical procedures corrected some of the physical malformations, while therapeutic interventions assisted in developing basic skills. In 1985, the Jackson Foundation was set up to coordinate the ongoing care and to support research into the rare genetic conditions seen in the community. The genetic material gathered from the family members turned into a priceless resource for researchers around the world, helping to identify specific genes linked to various rare conditions and contributing to the creation of predictive genetic tests. The valley where the community resided for over a century was converted into a natural reserve, featuring a small memorial to honor the hundreds of victims of an unplanned human experiment. The plaque at the memorial bears a simple message: in memory of those who lived and died in isolation, and as a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. The Jackson case brought about significant shifts in public policies concerning isolated communities. A number of states put monitoring programs in place to identify groups potentially at risk, particularly those with unconventional religious structures that might facilitate abuse. These programs must navigate the delicate balance between respecting religious freedom and safeguarding vulnerable individuals, especially children. In the realm of genetics, the case sparked renewed academic interest in the effects of inbreeding on human populations. Comparative studies with other historically isolated groups, like Amish communities, Mennonites, and island populations, helped to set clearer parameters regarding the risks associated with different degrees of kinship. In 2003, 2 decades after the community's discovery, a documentary team succeeded in locating and interviewing 45 survivors. Their stories revealed a variety of paths. Some had managed to integrate fully into mainstream society, starting families and building careers. Others were living in assisted communities, needing constant support, and some were still institutionalized, their bodies and minds forever marked by the involuntary genetic experiment they had endured. Jacob Jackson, who had been crucial in exposing the knowledge deliberately hidden by the elders, became a geneticist and devoted his career to studying rare diseases. "What happened to my family cannot be undone," he stated at a medical conference in 2010. "But we can make sure these lives were not lost for nothing. Each gene we identify, each mechanism we understand, each child we save from a condition we can now prevent or treat, is a victory over the ignorance that held my family captive for generations." Maybe the most lasting legacy of the Jackson case is the awareness of the dangers of consanguinity and the importance of genetic diversity for the health of human populations. In nations where marriages between cousins are still culturally accepted, educational programs now incorporate information about genetic risks and provide premarital counseling and testing. The preserved genetic samples from the Jackson community remain a valuable resource for researchers. In 2015, employing genetic sequencing technologies that were not available when the case was first uncovered, scientists managed to identify specific patterns of genetic decline over the 7 generations, offering unprecedented insights into how the human gene pool reacts to extreme isolation. The case of the Jackson family's 7 generations stands as one of the most extreme and thoroughly documented examples of the impacts of prolonged inbreeding in humans. It's a tale of isolation, control, and pain, but also one of resilience, scientific advancement, and ultimately, redemption through knowledge. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment that says, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and see who truly cares about the search for truth. Don't forget to like this video so it can reach more people, and share it with friends who are interested in real cases. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect time to join our community, one that isn't afraid to confront humanity's most difficult truths. Next week, we will bring you another, equally impactful case that will show how seemingly normal communities can conceal disturbing secrets for decades. Until then, remember, truth, no matter how painful it might be, is always the first step toward healing.